Well, hello and welcome to the latest webinar in our sustainability series, sponsored by CFM. Now, the quest to reduce the carbon footprint of aviation has been very much in the news this week, with Airbus at a summit in Toulouse talking up the prospects of a zero-emission aircraft being in service by 2035. And indeed, apart from the pandemic itself, decarbonising aviation has been very much the theme of 2021, with advances in the availability of sustainable aviation fuel and exciting developments in electric, hybrid electric, and hydrogen-powered propulsion. However, our webinar today is going to discuss a different challenge, that of using smarter air traffic management and other operational technologies and innovations to create an infrastructure in the skies that is kinder to the environment. This week's Airbus Summit also saw a demonstration flight from Paris to Toulouse of an aircraft flying an optimized trajectory. It's part of a program involving Air France and the French air navigation service provider to develop more energy-efficient flights as part of the CSAR Albatross project. And similar initiatives have been taking place in the US for almost 2 decades under the NextGen program. So to discuss the role that efficient management of the airways can play in the industry's wider sustainability ambitions, I'm joined by an eminent panel of experts. Stephen Moore is the head of Eurocontrol's ATM Network Operations Division, tasked with keeping delays in the skies over Europe to a minimum. Andrew Coleman is President and General Manager at GE Digital, responsible for aviation software and, in his words, unlocking the power that digital technology can bring to the aerospace industry. And finally, Murray Adams is Head of Fuel and Operations Efficiency for Qantas Group, and joining us all the way from Sydney. It's a job of Murray and his team to come up with ways of using analytics to drive economies in the airline's operation. Now, Stephen, let me start with you. The skies may have been quieter for 18 months, but those of us who travel frequently in Europe are all too familiar with finding ourselves in that holding pattern over a busy airport like Heathrow and maybe getting a great view of the London skyline, but just desperate to land and get off the plane. This may be a bit of an unfair question to start with, but how close is Europe to eradicating or at least seriously reducing delays caused by air traffic congestion?
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you, Meadow, for the the googly at the start of the webinar. In honesty, not very close to the purest answer to the question. Obviously, last year and so far this year, delays have been at an absolute minimum, but there have been some. This year, probably not directly connected with the structural issues of the airspace design, but other issues, COVID-related primarily, of course, with ANSPs. And their provision of services in some cases. So not very is the simple and most straightforward and honest answer. And as traffic increases and comes back next year, we predict in some places in excess of the demand of 2019, we are again going to see delays in the network. And we are obviously, as you appreciate, working exceptionally hard at Eurocontrol Network Manager to mitigate those now and do everything we can with scenarios to address them. But as we're talking about sustainability, of course, delays and sustainability is not the same conversation.
Okay, well, we'll certainly come back and discuss that later, because the whole ATM contribution to this is really a lot of what we're going to be focusing on today. Andrew, from an industry point of view, what can companies such as yours, such as GE, do to develop technology to make air operations more efficient?
For as long as our industry's been around, one of the things we're exceptional at is mastering physics. I mean, think about the physics of flight and all the innovation, all the greatness it's done for humanity. And yet when we think about the next 100 years, we feel like the greatest untapped asset, and we're in an industry that's really good at squeezing assets to the last day, but that untapped asset's data. And when we specifically think about flight data, not that long ago, I'm going to date myself a bit, but if we remember Polaroid pictures, remember how neat those were? You could take a picture, snap it out, and quickly see your friend, your family. But to be honest, it was blurry. It was kind of a snapshot in time and told a little bit of the story. Contrast that when the first time you saw football or golf or pick your favorite sport on television in high definition. For me, I love golf. I could see the dimples in the golf ball, the blades of grass. And once I did that, I never wanted to go back to old television or a Polaroid picture of a golf match. Well, the same is true with the data around us and the amount of data we have. It's at our fingertips to get a high definition movie of each and every flight, each and every movement. And inside of that, all kind of clues around sustainability and how we can lower our CO2 footprint today, not 10, 20, 30 years from now as more and more technology comes online. And we celebrate that technology. We're pumped about it at GE, but we still think there's a lot to do today with the data at our disposal. And I'll just point to Murray, who's on the panel with me today. Qantas has been very at the front end of this. Well before this was a vogue hot topic, they saw the benefit of it.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. I mean, we'll come on to that the timescale question, I'm sure later, because, you know, that's a whole question. I mean, 2050 is close, but it's not that close. And we need to really be moving in the right direction and moving probably a lot faster than we are now. Murray, Andrew's teed you up very, very in a great way there, but you know, I suppose we can discuss this as if it's, you know, it's a government's problem, it's a regulator's problem, it's society's problem. But, you know, but what can the airlines themselves do to make their operations more efficient, you know, here and now? You know, we can talk about choice of fleet, of course, but beyond that, what has Qantas been doing?
Yeah, sure. I think we'll put fleet aside. Fleet's got a long lead time, high capital investment. But if we look at the things that we can do here and now, there are a number of things that can be done within the operation. Fuel efficiency for Qantas isn't something that's new. As Andrew said, it's something we've been focused on with dedicated teams for over 15 years. But what I find really exciting is what we are now able to do with the vast volumes of data that are coming into the ecosystem. If we were to look even just 5 years ago at the volume of data that was coming off the aircraft compared to what we have today, it's opening up new and really exciting opportunities around how we can take that data, get better insight into how the operation's performing, get into a much lower level of detail than we've been able to before. And touching on what Stephen was saying, it's really then linking that into the new evolving systems that are happening within ATM to then pull it together to get the maximum output we can from the ecosystem.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that. Just before we continue, a reminder that this is an interactive webinar, and we very much encourage your questions. So please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and feel free to ask any questions. Keep them related, please, to the subject that we're discussing today, but within that, make them as wide-ranging as possible. And we'll try and get through as many of these as we can in the course of the next 50 minutes or so. Stephen, I want to just come back to you. You made the point there that, you know, delays doesn't necessarily, you know, you cannot just equate the whole sustainability argument to delays. Can you just expand on that a little bit more and talk about how, you know, how air traffic management providers can help with the industry's drive towards a sustainable future? Surely.
Delays and sustainability. So delays in the network is not a measure of the sustainability of the network in the environmental sense of sustainability. We have an issue, I think, a structural issue in the Eurocontrol network manager area. So the 43 states in total that's covered by the network manager. It's not like America with the FAA. It's not like other parts of the world. There are so many different actors in the ATM provision, let alone the other stakeholders in the network. And we've got this sort of three-way balance to deal with between the punctuality of the flights, and that in itself isn't a guaranteed metric. For most passengers, punctuality in their mind initially is pushing back from the gate on time. No one likes to be leaving an hour late, but with so much fat in many of the schedules pre-COVID, with regard to connections and so on and so forth, punctuality is actually more about arriving on time. And many of us that have had the unfortunate experience of arriving late are frustrated. I would rather always depart late and arrive on time, of course. But that comes to many things. So punctuality isn't straightforward. We've then got that against the sustainability of the fuel burn to get there, which obviously encompasses everything from the airport perspective through the flying of the network, the arrival sequence. You referred at the start, Murray, to the holding patterns at some airports, into the gate on arrival. And we set that off against also the other part of this particular triangle, the charging network of the European ATM infrastructure with regard to route charges that the airlines pay. So an airline may choose in normal circumstances to fly a route to avoid a delay, but that route is more expensive in terms of fuel burn, but cheaper in terms of charges. And with profit margins as they were in some cases, that can be down to the difference of 10, 20, 30, 40 euros. So it is a really difficult balance or juggling act between these three areas of fuel burn, punctuality, and the charges. And it's not just route charges, of course. EU 261 and delays to passengers and the recompense paid to those under the legislation in Europe means that there's another area of financing as well. We could, in some senses, deal with the delays in the network and help with sustainability, but we may actually see minutes of delay going up, but the sustainability being assisted. There's lots of things, I think, in the improvement side that we could do from the network perspective. We are at Eurocontrol getting rid, in a positive sense, of our spaghetti software, if you like, which is all intertwined, has been conceived in the 60s, 70s, built in the 80s, 90s, and had various plug-on systems into the network across the 62 different ANSPs and centers that we work with in regard to area control centers, and trying to refer to the colleague from Qantas there, get the single data points, whether it be in a B2B or a B2C environment from the network manager, and getting better trajectory management into the network will all help with delays and sustainability. But again, I go back to the first point, Europe isn't America, and it's a very obvious thing to say, but in an ATM world environment especially, it's critical. There are so many actors at state level, so many actors individually in ANSP level as well, that we do find there's a great deal to be done. But there is also a wonderful opportunity here to align and make sure we're aligning on the right things and the agreed things with regard to sustainability. That was a very long answer, I apologize.
No, that's just very clear, but I'm going to ask Andrew to come in as...
If I could just add something, I'm going to steal an old quote from Deming: "In God we trust, all others bring data." And one of the things I'm finding in this space is there's this belief that because we had a meeting 12 years ago to talk about this and couldn't make progress, it's just not worthy of trying again. And I know in this season, we don't sit down and have a cup of coffee like we used to, but I can't stress enough, the data exists. A lot of our customers were providing the data. Sit down with your local authority and show them your flight data and compare that with others and partner on, let's figure this out together. I totally see breakthroughs, and this doesn't sound ultra sophisticated. This isn't artificial intelligence with machine learning applied, just showing flight data over time and partnering. I think you'll be amazed at the progress. One operator reported to us, they took 12 minutes off per flight, just sitting down and partnering on how they were going to fly. And so I just want to make that point. I know it doesn't sound ultra sophisticated or highly digital, but it is powerful.
Well, it brings us into this whole idea of, and Murray, I'll bring you in a minute on this, but it brings us into this whole idea of using big data and smart data to come up with ways of operating more efficiently. And it may, it's not particularly sexy when it comes to sustainability, because everyone wants to talk about sustainable fuel and hydrogen power and everything, which is all great stuff. But a lot of the time it's just taking little incremental changes, taking little glitches out of the system to and using data to do that, I guess. Murray, I mean, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, sure. I think to add to Stephen's opening comments as well, I think we're a long way away from no delay. So the balance of delay and sustainability is something that we're going to have to live with, at least in the short term. And from an airline perspective, it's how do we manage that in the most efficient way? And I think the airlines are looking for some of that predictability and repeatability. We want the predictability to understand what's going to happen, how we can manage that delay, manage it in the most efficient way possible, be it ground delay, lateral hold rather than racetrack hold that's going to be inefficient. And then it's the repeatability. So knowing that day in, day out, that's something that we're going to be able to see. And then adding to Andrew's point, it's using that data to engage with the ANSPs to understand how that can be done, show the differences. We've seen some really great gains here in engaging with our ANSP and showing the differences in the efficiency of different holds and the different way that we can manage delay and losing time en route, as opposed to trying to lose that in the terminal area, which is much more inefficient for us. So I think there is going to be a need to continue to manage delay. And as we try and balance that against the sustainability goals, I think it's really important that we manage that in the most efficient way we can, until I really do hope we get to that stage where there's no delay. But similar to the fleet conversation, I think that's decades away, that we're still working towards that.
Yeah, I mean, I want to ask a very basic question. I mean, you know, if anyone could jump in and feel free to answer it. What is the link? And Stephen, you talked about this in your previous answer, but what is the link between, you know, how much does flight delays, and when I say delays, I mean, you know, congestion over airports, how much does that contribute to the whole sustainability, or the lack of sustainability?
It's a very good question in itself. So talking about airborne holding, I guess, not a great deal. In and of itself, of a single flight, yes, the airborne holding is usually the largest portion of that that CO2 for that flight, especially for the short haul flights. But in terms of overall CO2 emissions in the network, not a great deal. We all know of those airports where airborne holding exists. And usually, aside from the environmental impacts with regard to weather events, usually they are few and far between. They just happen at a few of the big significant airfields, where the pressure, the commercial pressure to keep the runway occupied, means that the most efficient way for doing that is to keep aircraft in the holding stacks, which is obviously what we see at places like Heathrow, for example, in normal times. So the answer to that is not a great deal, but it still contributes. And as Murray said, quite rightly, linear holding, extended track miles is, of course, much more effective. But this is where we're all talking in the same banner here around data and data sharing. With the new system, INM, that we're building at Eurocontrol with our stakeholders and the partners, which will deliver in 2 years and then incrementally from there onwards. It is all about sharing the data, the predictability in the network, as well as new concepts. Well, not new concepts, implementing concepts have been talked about for a long time, but have been very difficult hitherto to implement, such as 4D trajectory management across the network.
I mean, talk about that a little bit more, if you don't mind, Steve, because it's fascinating, that whole 4D trajectory management thing. What are the challenges still have to be overcome? Because I guess, you know, to be very simplistic about it, you know, if you can have more planes in the sky at the same time flying optimized trajectories, I guess that does, you know, help to deliver the sustainability goal.
Yes, very much. I mean, 4D trajectory management in and of itself it's much more about getting the predictability into the network. Currently, from a network management perspective, the flight plans, the final flight plans are in the system. And from then on, it is down to the point at which the aircraft is marked as airborne by whatever system, be it digital or manual, that does that into the network. And then that flight is, in effect, from a network management perspective, rigid in the system. Turning that into 4D trajectory management means that, in theory, up until about an hour ahead of the flight, again with the data sharing, that flight is not frozen into the network. So for a short 45-minute flight, not a great deal of difference, but from one part of the ECAC state to the other, so from, let's go top left-hand corner, Prestwick, all the way down to Istanbul, for example, that can make a significant difference in the network, let alone as we share data, ADSB data from around the world now with various partners coming across the Atlantic, coming from South America. 4D trajectory management will make a significant difference collectively.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take some questions from the audience. We're getting quite a few great questions in here from the audience now. One from Tony Hayes. I guess this is probably one for you, Andrew. Do you have software that is capable of minimizing emissions, CO2 and particulates on a flight, rather than simply fuel burn?
We do, and I really appreciate the question, Tony. About 6 years ago, we partnered with Qantas to start down this journey. Some of the fundamental things to get this right: we built an application that fits right in the middle, the electronic flight bag, and we built it directly with pilots, not with the C-suite, to yell at people and say, fly differently, but with pilots. First and foremost, safety as our first parameter. That will always be the case. We're never ever going to sacrifice that. But second, we quickly got to sustainability. And as I heard the conversation earlier about slots and how do we reduce CO2 there, these are some of the same operators, if I'm honest, that we see less than 2% of the time performing a single engine taxi. One of the easiest ways known to man to reduce CO2. And so we discovered, I know we all probably in some way, shape, or form have one of these, an Apple Watch or a Fitbit. Research says when you put one of these on, you'll take about 2,600 more steps a day because you have this little thing telling you where you are and what you need to do to get to your 10,000. Our data has shown the exact same thing when you put in the hands of a pilot how they performed, and then layer on top history. How they're doing. Are they getting better? Are they getting worse? No one has to call. No one has to yell. They self-correct. And over time, they get better and better. But the name of the application is Flight Pulse. It sits in the Apple Store. It's very easy to download. And we have many pilots around the world using this and driving lower CO2 as a result. I'll throw it over to Murray if you'd add anything. Thank you for the question, Tony.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think with all of this, there's no silver bullet with any of these things. And the approach that Qantas has been taking is it's the aggregation of marginal gains. So it's doing the small things repeatedly. And as Andrew was saying there, one of the big benefits we've seen is putting the data in the hands of the crew and them being able to see that a small gain that they may get for single engine taxi that Andrew used, it might be a small, somewhat meaningless 20, 50, 100 kilos that they're saving on their particular flight. But when we aggregate that across a particular fleet or the entire operation, that can save up to millions of kilos of fuel and therefore, a substantial reduction in CO2. So empowering that understanding of my small gain done repeatedly by me and then by my broader group of colleagues aggregates up to be something substantial. That's been one of the things that we've learned over time and have really seen with data, that empowering people to understand the role that they play and that their small benefit may seem small to them, but when we aggregate it across the entire cohort, then it becomes something more meaningful and something really quite substantial.
And I'll just add, when we compare ourselves to other industries, the auto industry, unfortunately, is way ahead of us in terms of there's hybrid cars, there's battery powered cars. And so their footprint is going to improve. It's a while out for us to see these technologies make its way to market. We've got to do these things. Or as an industry, we're going to look like more and more of an offender.
I think if I may, I agree entirely with both of you, really. In 2019, there was a study done from the Eurocontrol perspective on inter-network management flights, fuel burn based. And 28.5 million tons is the figure in 2019 for those intra-network management area flights. Based on, that's on the flight plan, and based on the actual flown route, it was 28.5 million tons, just a little bit underneath, a 0.10 of the million tons underneath. Those flights could have flown routes burning 26.19 million tons. So nearly a 9% potential fuel burn saving if the near best routes were flown today. But it comes back to the point, you're talking both about putting the data into the hand, in this case of the pilots. We could of course extend that to the air traffic controllers, to the dispatchers at the airports, everyone in the chain, getting the right data for them to make decisions. But what decisions are they going to be making? Is it based on the cost? Is it based on the profitability? Or is it one thing going to be based on the flight? planting trees to offset. In reality, until we stop, or until we decide collectively not to penalise for delay, but potentially to consider either penalties for sustainability measures or lack of sustainability score in flights, we're going to always end up with this difficult conversation about, well, yes, I could fly a sustainable route, or I could fly that route, which is longer but cheaper, and I get less delay because it's through less congested airspace. There's a lot to be thrown into this conversation for sure.
Yeah, I mean that's a fascinating point. I mean, how do you sort of reconcile the some of the politics of this and the economics of it with the drive for sustainability? Murray, I want to go back to a point you made there about and it's something I guess we can applies to everyone with when it comes to sustainability. What can we as an individual do on a micro basis? You take your bottles to the bottle bank. Well, what good is that when China's building coal power stations? But everyone can make a difference. In a sort of aviation context, how do you incentivize and how do you encourage your crews and your employees to buy into that message? How do you encourage the captains to just go that extra step to save a few dollars of fuel? Talk about how you sort of get that message across internally.
Yeah, so it's been a journey over the last 15 years, and over time it's evolved. I'm incredibly proud of the crew that we have at Qantas and their professionalism to buy into these sorts of activities. But we've really seen a positive increase in fuel efficiency activity over the last 3 or 4 years, where we've started talking more about the impact of those small savings that our crew can make and what that translates into the environmental impact that they are reducing. And that can be as simple as sort of translating some of those benefits of the small individual initiatives that then aggregate up, and then translating that into the equivalent of taking family cars off the road for a year. So it's about saying that it might be something that seems small, but when aggregated up makes a big difference. And then here's the equivalent of what it is if you were to do something else in your life. So really making it tangible, giving ownership to our pilots around what they can do. And then really just having that continuous feedback and being able to tell them that we're seeing the progress. And as Andrew said, Flight Pulse has been a great application for us that we've been using in putting that in the hands of the pilots so they can see their performance relative to their fleet peer group. They can only see their own data. It's not something that we're monitoring the individuals within the office. So we're not having those individual conversations. It's about creating that self-learning moment so that the crew can see. And we've had plenty of pilots in this instance coming in, talking to their training departments, trying to understand why they sit in a particular part of a distribution relative to the rest of their fleet group. And we've seen some really, really positive outcomes with that. As Stephen rightly said, Flight Pulse is putting the data in the hands of the pilots. We've seen the same thing with what we can do with our flight dispatchers, and then taking that data as well around what we can do with our flight dispatchers to incentivize them really understanding the role that they play in getting the most efficient flight that we can. And then also how they can partner with our air navigation service providers to have that conversation around some of those trade-offs. What are the trade-offs? What are the things that we're trying to solve for? And I think it's going to be an important conversation for the industry as a whole over the next few years as we really do focus on sustainability. How do we look at what are some of those other things that are potentially negatively impacting sustainability, and how can we incentivize the right outcomes for that so that we can achieve the sustainability goals in the near term and continue on that path to 2030 to 2050 as we start getting the technological change as well.
Yeah, that's great, Murray. I want to come to you, Andrew, on a point you made earlier about timescales, because we talk about next generation engines and other major breakthrough technologies that could deliver step change improvements in a decade, perhaps in a decade and a half, 2 decades. But what you talked about this earlier, but just give me some examples of small things that airlines in particular could be doing now using data to make their operations more efficient and less wasteful?
I think it first goes back again, you've got to put data in the hands of those that can make a difference. And it's frankly not the home office, although it's good to roll it up in aggregate. It's the pilots, it's the people on the front line. When you do that, again, I know this is going to sound so simple. There's basic things we've known forever that make a whole lot of sense, that almost in a Dunning-Kruger effect, we think we have done these things, and they're in our past. I was with an airline a couple of weeks ago. They're like, of course, 100% of our pilots do this. And because we have their flight data and are trusted to provide that to them, we said, no, about 2.5% are. They were floored when they saw that. We looked at one of their operations in Denver and compared it to others as far as how they're approaching and landing. And through Airspace Insights, we're able to show them with data, this is your operation, and it's about 2 million more efficient than the next folks. And that's just the fuel savings. So you multiply that out by the CO2 piece, you get a 2-for-1. And so the three most basic are just, how are you taxing? How are you using the APU? And how are you doing fuel? And I know each of those come with asterisks and a lot of industry knowledge we've learned from. And so I'm not saying all the time, every time, but 90% of the time, there's just great benefits to be had. I'll use a US example. When we do these things and see the CO2 consumption come down by 1%, and one of the big four here, that's the equivalent of we just took 80,000 Ford pickups off the road. 80,000. So big changes with small procedural changes are within our grasp. The last point I'll make is it's just, for me, so interesting as you see basically two camps forming. The airlines that are making the 2050 promises and have no idea how to get there other than buying new planes. And the airlines that say today, or in Murray's case, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, this was so important, I'm going to work this into my daily operation. This is just who I am. And I think the market is prepared to reward the airlines that have done that. The airlines that don't, I think not that long from now will probably be perceived almost like a tobacco company if we're not careful. And we don't want that at all.
That's again a very interesting point. I mean, we're going to go on in our next webinar. Actually, we don't want to spend too much time on it now, but the whole consumer side of this argument and how that whole flight shaming and negative perception of airlines could turn people away from flying. But we'll deal with that on another day. But I just wanted to touch on one aspect of this, and you talked, Andrew, there about it should be a win-win. What's good for the environment should be good for an airline's bottom line. But there are times, and Stephen, you talked about this before, and I'm taking a question here from forgive the pronunciation, Shantanu Sohini, about this whole compromise between she's asking she's asking wouldn't not taking the most cost-effective route shoot ticket prices up? How do you strike a balance? So it's that whole question of will this end up costing passengers and airlines money?
Yes, I mean, take sustainable aviation fuel, and I notice there's something in the chat around there, or the Q&A around there as well. Yes, but as the colleagues have said, at some point we have to take that leap, take that step. Yes, we can do a lot with the incremental changes. There's an awful lot we can do, but to get to carbon neutral, it's not enough. It really isn't enough. Whereas things like sustainable aviation fuel, the changes that we're talking about incrementally wise, will mean that we'll end up with, I think, the changes that are required. But when the UK government many years ago now put on the tax, the departure tax, I forget the name of it. There was not a decrease in flying, but the flight ticket prices went up because, of course, the airlines passed through the cost immediately to the customer. So not necessarily changing the flight ticket prices changes people's behaviour, which is the reverse to the way the question was asked. It is entirely possible that the consumer will have to pay for this, of course, but the consumer is the one who is ultimately benefiting from the transport that's being provided. There are loss leaders that can be done, and we all need to invest in this to make the whole aviation network sustainable for the future. And while I've got the mic for a second, again, coming back to the sustainability, You asked the question a minute ago, Murray, around the airlines, but from the perspective of the airports, there's a lot of incremental things that can be done at the airports. With colleagues in my airport unit, we're looking at second runway aiming points. We're looking for noise reduction benefits, operational airport delay and influences. There's things like taxi, but there's lots of things that can be done now that are available now to make a difference. And those things, shouldn't be overlooked. And we're talking about, emissions, ultimately CO2. We mustn't forget about the noise emissions as well. And, combined emission monitoring is another important area that will allow people that are able to make the decisions to make the decisions based on, again, the data.
Thanks, Stephen. That brings us on to a question that we've had from Milan Janik, I think it is. And talking about airports, what role, we've talked about the broader ATM question, but what role do the airports themselves have to play in this? Stephen touched on a lot of items there, more economical taxiing, better sort of ways of moving aircraft around the airports. Murray, do you have a view on that? What can airports do to contribute to this?
It's a similar message to what I've said before. I think there's lots of small things that we can do, and just picking up, I'll come back to that in a second, but picking up on what Stephen was talking about there in the previous question, if we're looking at, say, a 2030 target and needing to use biofuel to meet that, biofuel is at a higher cost. But for us, and the way that Qantas is looking at this, we're looking at what are the things that we can do, those operational small gains that we can get. The more of that we can be doing now, the more of those savings that we can be banking today, the less gap we're going to have to that target in 2030. So it's really important for us to be starting and working on those things now to try and get as much of that gain as we can. If we wait 5, 10, 15 years before we try and start those things, the gap that we're trying to bridge in terms of sustainable fuels or offsets or whatever the mechanism is going to be larger. So it's really important to get those operational efficiencies in today to lower that baseline that then you're trying to step up to those interim targets. And I think that's where airports have a really important role to play. There's lots of things that we can do. We've touched on a number of them around sort of efficient taxi and making sure that the infrastructure is there to enable free movement around the airport. The other one that I think it was Andrew touched on before is around APU management, making sure that the infrastructure is there, available, reliable, so that where the aircraft is on the gate, it has a viable alternative that is priced accordingly so that the airlines aren't having to use jet fuel. It goes back to a point we were talking about before around having the right incentives in place so that when the aircraft is at the gate, it is plugged in, not using jet fuel, using a more environmentally sustainable alternative to provide electrics and air conditioning. It's really convenient using jet fuel in the APU to power and air condition the aircraft, but it's not the most environmentally responsible way of doing it. And we should be working with the airports to make sure that that infrastructure is there, available, reliable, and priced appropriately so that that alternative can be used wherever it's possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably something that, I've been hearing about, and we've been writing about a lot of these innovations for many, many years. You still don't see an awful lot of them about electric taxis, not using fuel for APUs when the aircraft's on the ground. Andrew, do you have a view on this? I mean, the airport's role. What more could we do on the ground to make aviation more sustainable?
A couple of things, and to jump on your point, a decade ago, anywhere you went, you saw a trash can. Today, can you imagine going anywhere and not seeing a second recycled trash can? And yeah, there was extra cost, and yeah, there was extra infrastructure, and today we don't even think about it. It's just, no matter where you go, it's just part of what we do because we know it's the right thing to do. I think in the very similar vein, that's how we're going to have to approach this. When I think about the airports, if I could give one very direct piece of advice, please get out of the tower and partner with the airlines. It's on the airlines to bring the data, as I mentioned at the beginning. But if you're in one of those roles, the airlines need your partnership right now really, really bad. And they need you to meet them halfway and listen, not here I am, come to me and figure this out. I think it's just, we do such good for humanity. Can you imagine the world without flight? And yet there's going to be a time not that far from now where there's going to be potentially shaming and a lot of reasons to not get on airplanes anymore. I don't want to be a part of that part of human history. Our industry's done more to connect people than anything. The telephone, the internet, Facebook, all of that. And so again, sorry to sound a little bit alarmist, this is a big deal that we got to get right.
Stephen, you talked about you brought up the airports. I mean, you're not directly in charge. Eurocontrol doesn't run the airports, but I mean, what could airports do with airlines? You know, quite often airlines and airports are sort of seen as, you know, they're fighting each other because they're you know, trying to trade off against each other. But I mean, what could airports do to work with airlines and with the regulators to just to make these sort of small incremental changes that will deliver a difference?
I think there's, you know, I think there's some amazing examples of airports that are doing just that. And I apologise to some of the 563 airports that I might not mention in the next 30 seconds in the European network. You know, so take Schiphol, for example. The work they have been doing, and then of course the Netherlands has a long history of environmentally aware, can I put it like that? But the work they are doing with regard to, you know, trying to keep as close to zero emissions as possible is phenomenal. Not just from running their estate at a zero emissions or renewable energy basis, but also with regard to simple things such as TaxiBot. Just to go back to Murray's point, I think it was about making these things efficient. I was on a webinar earlier this year around the airport sustainability, and there was a gentleman there who was, you know, proponing the expert's opinion about TaxiBot. TaxiBot pays for itself in terms of fuel savings very quickly, not the actual TaxiBot itself, which costs, let's say, some millions, but companies that provide the taxi box and then rent them out to get the aircraft almost to the end of the runway if the infrastructure is appropriate. You know, that's sort of the savings on fuel there. We're not talking single engine taxi, we're talking no engine taxi. You know, then you've just got to plan the delay into the network with regard to the trajectory management of starting the engines, especially with modern engines, which take a bit longer to get to the operating temperatures and to be safe before they're then used under stress. But those sorts of things are possible again with the sharing of data. The other thing I think we ought not to forget about is, you know, airports don't just stop and start at the gate. Depending on how you define the airspace and how you split it from nation to nation, but you know, airports also include that TMA type airspace around them. So there are things that we can do. You mentioned holding much earlier, but point merge, of course, more effective and efficient approaches are also things that airports can get involved with. And to Andrew's point about getting out of the tower, you know, these sort of collaborations that we work on in the European level through the collaborative decision making and the working groups across all of the stakeholders are where real changes like these can be made. But it does require people to start talking and getting behind the same concept and the same target around sustainability.
Thanks, Stephen. I just want to get on to, we've touched on this already, but I just want to get on to timescales. You know, give me an idea of how quickly we can make a difference. You know, I think Murray and Andrew, all of you have said this can be done pretty quickly, but let's look over the next, we're in 2021. What can be done by 2025? What can be done realistically by 2030? And let's just keep it to what we're talking about here: air traffic management, smarter airports. Let's leave off the whole kind of next generation propulsion thing for the time being. You know, give me some ideas of timescales, Murray. Where's Qantas going to be in 5 years' time, 10 years' time?
We'll be continuing on this journey. We won't be done, I think, is the simple answer to it. And what we've learned over the last 15 years with fuel efficiency is the breadth of what we need to do, and the return we get continues to get smaller. So we've got to be doing more things that are giving us smaller benefit. But then when we aggregate them up, it still becomes something meaningful. So if I look ahead 5 years, I think we'll just continue in that trajectory when we look at operations. I think we'll be taking more of the data that's coming into the ecosystem. We'll be working with the ANSPs in terms of data interoperability and how do we better exchange that data for some of those things like holding, and where we can better get sort of that information share happening. I don't think we'll find a silver bullet in the next 5 years. So I think we're going to continue on this journey of looking for lots of small things that we can do repeatedly and aggregate it up. But by doing that, I still think we'll be making sizable gains year on year that will continue to deliver to those interim goals out to 2030. And then sort of look ahead and see how the new technology, the new fleets can come in and support that. And that will be that point of intersection that we start planning for in 5-10 years' time.
Okay. Andrew, what is your view on timescales? What can the industry genuinely achieve in 5-10 years? Leave aside 2050 for the moment.
We as a business have put a moonshot out. We want to knock down 1% a year for each of our customers. So 1% each year on their CO2 emissions. And so you start to extrapolate that across our industry. If we could rally around these basic things and learn and build from each other, just like we do with safety, and start to see this 1% a year, you move that needle 10% over the next decade, it's gigantic.
Okay. I'm going to try and take, Stephen, do you want to come in on that one quickly before?
Very briefly, yeah, I can do very briefly. Thank you. I think I agree, Murray, particularly with regard to the incremental changes for airports, but also we're working an operational excellence program with all of the stakeholders in the European network, which will make a number of significant incremental changes as well. At the same time, investing 300 million euros into the integrated network management system, which is coming on stream by 2024, 23, 24, and then delivering again. I think we will make some significant changes by 2030. I can't put a figure on it, but for me, the key is while we're delivering these incremental changes, we are agreeing and signing up to and committing and coordinating and collaborating on what is the target that we are working to, the sustainability target, what is it, and how can we collectively deliver on it? Because tough decisions will have to be made.
Okay, I'm going to try and take, we're coming to the last sort of 10 minutes or so of the webinar, but I want to just try and take a couple of audience questions. These are quite technical ones, so I'm going to fire them at you anyway and see what you come up with. One from Peter Gordon: operating runways and airways at close to capacity causes delays. Is there any optimum level of utilization, say 90% runway capacity? What's your thinking around that?
I think for every runway, there is an optimum capacity based not just on the runway, but the weather, environmental conditions at the time, the airport capacity, the border force capacity at any particular time. There's so many different levels. In terms of aircraft movements on and off a runway, I think the question refers to 99% at Heathrow causes delays. It doesn't cause delays. When there's an issue, then the delays magnify and bounce greatly at that point. When it works really well, and as an ex-London air traffic controller, I do have some experience with it. When it works and we're landing 46 plus aircraft an hour into Heathrow, there are no delays, keeping the pressure up and with a sort of 5 to 10 minute holding in that sense. But I think there's an optimum capacity for each runway and each airport, and that can change. But we work closely with many airports from a Eurocontrol perspective to try and capitalize upon their capacity and make sure that's fed in. There's another actor in the system that we haven't mentioned around the slot coordination process. You can sell slots for a runway, but if you can't meet the capacity to what's being sold to the airlines, then it's almost a theoretical exercise, and that builds in delay before the day has even turned up.
Yeah. To add to that and put some things in there. Thanks for the question, Peter. I think it's really around balancing a number of different sort of priorities and things that you're trying to solve for. I think the commercial demand's the first one, is what's the demand that's going to the airport, and making sure that you can balance that against the weather constraints and the throughput constraints that exist within the airport. The optimal amount to have on the runway really depends on the airport and a number of different things that are coming in to that airport, what supporting infrastructure there is, what the airspace around that looks like, and the ability to then balance those all out. I'd love to find a single number for every airport, but I think it's pretty specific for the individual airports and the goals that you're trying to solve within that particular airport, and by time of day as well, based on the demand that's there.
I mean, this is quite a simplistic one, maybe, but I guess, and it gets into the whole world of network planning and stuff outside the remit of this webinar. But very, very simplistically, we have a lot of very, very congested hub airports. We have a lot of other airports where they're crying out for airlines to come and fly there. Is there a case to be made for airlines changing the way that the places that they fly to, and maybe getting better ground links to make these secondary airports more efficient and spreading the load a bit rather than everything coming into, what I don't know what percentage it is, but a huge percentage of European traffic coming into four or five big hubs. I mean, it's a big question, but does anyone have a view on that as to whether that's a route that the industry might go down over the next few years?
I can add some experience from a Qantas and an Australian perspective. As we return to flying, we've opened up 29 new routes. So we're operating more point to point between different airports that weren't on our network map going into the pandemic. So we're seeing that changing behavior occurring, and we're seeing the demand from customers coming in to try and avoid some of that flying through major hubs. So we're excited by that. We're seeing the demand there for it to be flying more direct between different locations, and 29 new routes opening up, coming out as we return to fly is really exciting for us. And it's really starting to move some of that traffic in a different way to what it was before we were going into the pandemic. And I think that's only going to continue as flying continues to return and people are looking for more options of where they can go. So I think there will be a bit of a shift in that. I think major hub airports will continue to play a role of how do you funnel in traffic to particular areas. But as you said, Murdo, that's really the sort of network design question of how much can you actually use assets across multiple different airports.
Yeah, I see this in spades, Murdo, here in Austin, Texas, where my home is. To the north, there's a large hub, and to the east, there's a large hub, Houston and Dallas. And yet the amount of point-to-point options being brought here to Austin, the expansion is it's amazing. Flights to London, flights to Punta Cana, Dominican Republic, all over the place. Not far down the road, we also have to think about eVTOL and some of the capability. I know it sounds like science fiction, but that day's coming pretty quick. And so it's a challenge for us all to figure out, but also an opportunity to change the way we connect people.
Excellent. Well, eVTOL's the subject for a whole different webinar, I think, and we maybe in the future we'll get onto that one. Stephen, very quick one for you. And again, I know it's not your remit, but would airlines making more use of the 500 and something, I forget the figure that you quoted, major airports in Europe, help with sustainability and take the load off the delays that hub-based operations lead to?
In short, not as much as I think people would imagine. Airlines are going to go where they can make money. Apart from those public service routes which are funded by governments, and there aren't that many of them, although they do exist, of course, in different countries and intercontinental as well. So if there's a demand, they'll do it. And as Murray rightly says, they're seeing demand in new point-to-point connections where people don't want to go through big hubs, and especially perhaps post-COVID world where people want to try and keep away from other people, or certainly large amounts of other people. So it will make a difference, but it actually all comes down, I think, from a network perspective to getting the predictability into the system. If we've got the plans and if we're sharing them and we're utilizing perhaps NDAs if required, non-disclosure agreements between airlines and airports and ANSPs, we can actually manage the predictability with better systems much better, and that will make a difference for sure.
Okay, excellent. We're just about coming to the end of the webinar. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to ask you all one final question, and that's going to be, what's the one thing that you would like to see? It doesn't necessarily have to be something that you're doing yourself, but what's the one thing that you think would make a huge, perhaps small thing, would make a huge difference to sustainability? What's the one thing that you would like to see in the next 5-10 years? Let's start with Andrew. Let's start with you.
For me, very simply, flight pulse in the hands of every pilot around the world. And I'm saying that not because GE wants to make a lot of money at this. We've priced this, frankly, less than what you pay for Netflix every month. This is so much bigger than a profitability or a commercial venture. It will move the needle immediately. And so that for me would be my answer. Every pilot seeing their data before and after every flight and able to self-correct.
Excellent. Okay, and the name of that product again, just to give you that commercial.
Flight Pulse.
Right, great. Because someone did ask that as one of the questions. Murray, what about from your side of things?
I think it's greater collaboration. I think the biggest gains that we can make in this space is by everyone working together. And I think we've touched on it a lot through this. It's about having the right incentives. It's about having the right metrics that we're trying to solve for. But what we have to do is all be working together. And I think the industry has changed. The data is now available. The technology is there for us to be able to analyze and support it. It's about now taking that and working collaboratively together on the same goals so that we can make those step changes over the near term and then meet those longer term goals as they come through.
Great. And Stephen, what's the one thing that you'd like to see?
Yeah, I'm gonna say the one thing I'd like to see is actually four things, but they're very brief. To Murray's point, facilitating a pan-European stakeholder cooperation approach to this problem. That's absolutely a key area for us here in Europe. Improving public awareness as well. We must be careful not to self-flagellate too much. Aviation has come a significantly long way in the last 20 to 30 years with regard to its sustainability. So we mustn't forget that, and we must really be clear about where we can improve and where we have improved. Then it's the data, developing the environmental impact assessments, the modelling, the tools, forward-thinking solutions, daring to challenge and think differently. And then finally, from our perspective, Eurocontrol, providing that technical support to the European institutions, member states, and the industry at large.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, that just about brings us to the end of another fascinating discussion. I'd like to thank all our panelists for giving so generously of their time today, particularly Murray, we should say, who's joined us at a very late hour from Australia, but Andrew very early over in Texas as well. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you too for your questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get through more of them, but we covered quite a few. Our next webinar is on the 11th of November, when we'll be looking again at sustainability, but through a slightly different lens. I did talk about this earlier. We're going to be looking at consumer behavior and how consumer demand could drive the direction of the industry. How will public attitudes to flying affect the way that the airline industry is operating in the next decade or more? And we're once again delighted to have CFM as our sponsor for that webinar, and we'll be announcing speakers very soon. So please join us for that. But in the meantime, thank you for being part of our webinar today. Take care and goodbye.